A sick millionaire asked the nurse to pretend to be his wife for one day. Don Julian, a retired architect and millionaire, was gravely ill and asked his young caregiver, Clara, to pretend to be his wife to protect him from his greedy brother. He had spent much of his life designing some of the most emblematic buildings in the city. His success in architecture made him extremely rich, with properties across the country and a seemingly endless fortune. However, as the years passed, his health deteriorated, leaving him vulnerable and alone. The diagnosis of a severe heart condition forced him into early retirement, and over time, his life shrank to the walls of his enormous mansion, once full of activity but now empty. Clara, a 25-year-old caregiver, entered his life through a recommendation from a private hospital. With her face always brightened by a kind smile, she brought an aura of calm that soothed Don Julian. Despite her youth, she already knew suffering. She had spent the past years caring for her gravely ill mother, forcing her to work long hours to pay costly medical bills. This was why she accepted the job. Not only did it provide a decent income, but it also gave her the chance to help someone in need. Soon, however, Clara realized something was wrong in Don Julian's mansion. Beyond the unsettling silence, there was a presence hovering over the place like a shadow. Diego, Don Julian's younger brother. Diego was cunning, having managed to avoid public scrutiny for years, despite his reputation in financial circles for being ruthless in business. In the first few weeks, Clara noticed Diego rarely visited his brother, but when he did, he was excessively kind, almost to the point of being fake. He called him "dear brother" and spoke in a syrupy tone, but as soon as Clara or another staff member left, his expression shifted to one of pure contempt. Over time, Don Julian began to open up to Clara. One afternoon, while sitting on his bed, looking out the window at the vast garden he had designed himself years ago, he confessed something that tormented him. "Clara, my brother Diego, is not what he seems. He distanced himself from me years ago, and I know he's only coming back now because he sees an opportunity to take what belongs to me. He fears me more than he respects me because I've always controlled my business, but now, with my health weakened, I see the ambition in his eyes. I feel like he's waiting for me to die to take everything." Clara, who had already noticed Diego's strange behavior, couldn't help but feel a pang of concern. "What can I do, Mr. Julian?" she asked sincerely, knowing that, as his caregiver, her responsibilities were limited to ensuring he took his medicine and accompanying him throughout the day. Don Julian looked at her intently, his eyes tired but still full of the wisdom of the years. "I need you to help me keep Diego at bay. I'm convinced he wants me to sign some documents to take my fortune, but I can't allow him to do so. If you pretended to be my wife, perhaps he would think you have control over my legal affairs and stay away at least for a while." Clara remained silent. Don Julian's proposal was completely unexpected, and although his intention was to protect his legacy, the request was enormous. Pretend to be his wife? Clara thought. The weight of what that implied became clear to her. Not only would she have to lie to Diego, but to everyone around Don Julian. Moreover, it would mean being more involved in his life than she had anticipated. However, Clara couldn't deny that she felt connected to Don Julian in a way she hadn't expected. She had come to appreciate him not just as her employer, but also as a father figure. He always treated her with respect and kindness, something she hadn't experienced in a long time, given the difficult circumstances of her personal life. Despite the strange request, Clara felt she couldn't refuse it. Don Julian was a vulnerable man, and there was no one else who genuinely cared for him. Finally, Clara agreed, although with some hesitation. "I'll do what you ask, Don Julian, but we must be careful. Diego is not stupid, and if he finds out what we're doing, he could become more dangerous." Don Julian nodded slowly, grateful for Clara's loyalty. "I know, Clara. And believe me, the last thing I want is to put you in danger. But I don't see another option. I need to keep Diego at a distance until I can reorganize my legal affairs in a way that he can't touch them." So, with a new mission in mind, Clara began to play her role as Don Julian's fictitious wife. At first, it was simple. She just needed to be present during Diego's visits, smile kindly, and drop hints that she had an active role in Don Julian's financial matters. However, as the days passed, the situation became more complicated. Diego began to suspect. He couldn't understand how his brother, who had never shown interest in marriage, had suddenly found a wife, and much less one as young as Clara. Clara, on her part, felt the weight of the lie every time Diego appeared at the mansion. But she also knew she couldn't fail Don Julian, who seemed more weakened by his illness every day. Don Julian's life, fortune, and legacy now depended on her ability to keep at bay a man who would do anything for money. Clara, a 25-year-old woman struggling to pay off her mother's medical debts, had accepted the job, feeling compassion for Julian and his loneliness. She had always been a strong and resilient person, traits she had developed from a young age. Raised in a small town, her life had been marked by her mother's illness, a woman whose health had always been fragile. For as long as Clara could remember, her mother had been in and out of the hospital, battling a degenerative disease that never seemed to give her a break. With her father absent and no other close family members, Clara had taken on the role of caregiver at an early age. This forced her to mature quickly and find work as soon as possible to cover the growing medical bills that were suffocating the family. She worked as a waitress, shop assistant, and eventually decided to take a basic nursing course that allowed her to get jobs as a caregiver for elderly or sick people. That's how she ended up working for Don Julian. The salary they offered was much higher than any other job, and although at first she hesitated to accept it because of the mansion's remoteness from the city, she couldn't afford to refuse. Moreover, Don Julian's story moved her. A man who had had everything but was now alone, forgotten by almost everyone, and facing a premature death without the support of his family. The first day Clara arrived at the mansion, she realized that there was something profoundly lonely about Don Julian's life. Although the house was enormous, decorated with art and relics from his years of success as an architect, there was a lack of warmth that made everything feel empty. Unlike other patients she had worked for, Don Julian didn't complain or demand constant attention. On the contrary, he seemed resigned to his fate. He spent long hours looking out the windows, observing the gardens he had designed himself, as if those moments allowed him to temporarily escape reality. Clara soon began to notice the small things that made Don Julian different from her other patients. For one thing, he was always polite and considerate with her, something that wasn't common in her line of work. Most of the people she had cared for, especially the elderly, tended to be irritable and difficult due to their illnesses. But Don Julian was different. Even on the days when he felt weakest, he always made an effort to be kind. He never raised his voice or demanded more than he needed. This made Clara feel even more determined to help him, not just because it was her job, but because she felt a deep empathy for him. The relationship between them began to grow. Clara, who initially saw Don Julian as just another employer, soon started to view him as something closer to a mentor or even a father figure. Their conversations became longer and more personal. Don Julian spoke to her about his youth, his love for architecture, and how he had designed some of the most iconic buildings in the city. He spoke with passion about his work, but also with sadness about how, despite his success, he hadn't managed to build a family of his own. Clara, for her part, told him about her mother and the challenges she faced in trying to pay for her treatments. Don Julian, upon hearing her, realized that Clara wasn't just a hard-working young woman, but also a person with an immense heart, willing to sacrifice everything for the well-being of others. It was during one of those moments, as Clara prepared him tea and they talked about life, that Don Julian made the strange request for her to pretend to be his wife. "I'm not doing it for myself," he explained, "but because I don't want Diego to take everything I've built." At first, Clara wasn't sure what to think. The idea of pretending to be the wife of someone much older than her was strange and somewhat uncomfortable. Moreover, Clara wasn't someone who could lie easily. She had always been transparent and honest in her life, even when things were difficult. However, Don Julian's situation moved her deeply. She knew he was alone and vulnerable, and the idea of his brother taking advantage of him was unbearable. Additionally, Clara was aware that if Diego managed to control Don Julian's fortune, it wouldn't just be an injustice for her employer, but also for the mansion's employees and those who depended on him. After thinking it over carefully, Clara accepted the plan, not without warning Don Julian about the risks. "This could get complicated," she told him. "Diego seems very cunning, and if he finds out what we're doing, things could get worse." However, Don Julian reassured her, telling her that he trusted her and that together they would find a way to protect his legacy. Clara committed herself to playing her new role with the utmost discretion. It wouldn't be an easy task, as she would not only have to deceive Diego, but also the mansion staff and any visitor who came to the house. But Clara was meticulous and had a great ability to adapt. Day by day, she immersed herself in the role of the protective wife, always staying by Don Julian's side during Diego's visits and dropping subtle hints that suggested she was aware of the finances and legal matters of her husband. The complicity between the two grew. Don Julian felt relieved to see Diego showing signs of frustration, while Clara felt she was doing something truly meaningful. During one critical night, Clara saved Don Julian from a severe heart crisis, which increased her distrust of Diego, who had isolated him from the rest of the family. It was a quiet night at the mansion, but the calm that enveloped the property would soon be interrupted. Clara, after spending most of the day attending to Don Julian, decided to take a break. Although her role as a caregiver was exhausting, she performed it with dedication, especially since she had begun to notice certain signs of deterioration in Julian's health that deeply concerned her. Don Julian had had a difficult week. His heart problems, which usually manifested as mild episodes of shortness of breath and extreme fatigue, had intensified. Clara knew his condition was critical and required constant attention, but she also knew that despite everything, Julian was stubborn and didn't like to show weakness. That night, after making sure he had taken his medication and was comfortably settled in his bed, Clara retired to her small resting room in one of the mansion's wings. However, shortly after midnight, an alarming sound broke the stillness of the night. A faint but constant tapping came from Don Julian's room. Clara, who always slept with her senses on alert, woke up immediately, feeling a sense of unease that quickly transformed into a feeling of urgency. She quickly got up, running towards Julian's room without even taking the time to put on her shoes. Upon arriving, the scene she found was alarming. Don Julian was slumped to one side of his bed, coughing violently and clutching his chest. His face was pale, and his lips were beginning to turn a bluish gray, a clear sign that he was lacking oxygen. Clara felt a rush of adrenaline course through her body as she quickly assessed the situation. Without wasting time, she ran to him, carefully positioning him in a more comfortable position while trying to calm him and ease his breathing. "Breathe with me, Don Julian. Calm down. Breathe deeply," she said, as she took his wrist to feel his pulse, which was erratic and weak. Don Julian could barely respond, his breathing becoming increasingly irregular, and in his eyes both pain and fear were reflected. Clara knew this was more than just a simple episode of fatigue. Julian was experiencing a severe heart attack, something that required immediate attention. Clara, who had received basic training in medical emergencies, knew she had to act quickly. There was no time to wait for emergency services, so with as much calm as she could muster, she grabbed the defibrillator she always kept on hand, following the advice of Julian's doctors. Although she had never had to use it in real situations before, she had familiarized herself with the device and knew what to do. "Sir, hold on, please," she murmured as she prepared the defibrillator. She placed the pads on Julian's chest, meticulously following the steps while her heart raced with the tension of the situation. The device emitted a series of beeps that seemed to last an eternity, but finally it delivered the shock. Don Julian's body jerked slightly, and for a moment, Clara held her breath, hoping for a miracle. The silence that followed was overwhelming. Julian was motionless, and Clara, with her heart in her throat, leaned in to check his breathing. To her relief, he exhaled weakly, and although his pulse was still irregular, it had begun to stabilize. The crisis had passed, but Clara knew Julian was not out of danger yet. Despite her own exhaustion and the tension of the moment, Clara stayed by his side throughout the night, monitoring his vital signs and ensuring he breathed regularly. As she watched him, her mind began to replay everything that had happened in the past few months. The relationship between Don Julian and his brother Diego had always been tense, but as Julian's health worsened, Diego's presence at the mansion also grew more unsettling. Diego appeared more frequently, asking overly detailed questions about his brother's assets, his will, and his health. As the night wore on and Julian's breathing became more stable, Clara couldn't help but wonder if Diego knew more than he let on. Why was he so interested in his brother's legal documents right at the moment when his health had begun to decline so alarmingly? Everything seemed too coincidental. At dawn, as the first rays of sunlight began to illuminate the mansion, Don Julian woke up weakly, his eyes opening with difficulty. Clara, who had been by his bedside the whole time, leaned toward him, placing a hand on his shoulder to comfort him. "Everything is okay, Don Julian. The worst part is over," she whispered, though deep down she knew the fight was far from over. Julian, still recovering from the episode, nodded slowly. It took him a moment to gather strength, but when he finally spoke, his words were clear and decisive. "Clara, I don't trust Diego. He's waiting for my death, I know it. If we don't do something soon, he will take everything I've built." Clara looked at him intently, her face full of concern but also of resolve. She had suspected Diego for weeks, but hearing Don Julian confirm it gave her a new perspective on the gravity of the situation. Clara knew she had to do more than just care for Julian's physical health. She also needed to protect him from the threats coming from within his own family circle. In the following days, Clara was more alert than ever. She knew that Diego would soon appear again, and when he did, she had to be prepared. Despite Don Julian's slow recovery, Clara kept a close eye on any suspicious movement or change in Diego's attitude. She knew he was waiting to take advantage of any moment of weakness to push his brother into signing documents that would alter the course of his fortune. Don Julian, still weakened, began to speak more openly with Clara about his suspicions. He told her how Diego had started to subtly involve himself in his business a few years earlier, always appearing interested in helping, but in reality, looking for ways to control the money. Don Julian, always shrewd, had resisted until now, but he knew his time was running out. Meanwhile, Clara continued with her role as the fictitious wife, keeping Diego at a distance and ensuring that Don Julian didn't feel alone or unprotected. But she knew she couldn't keep pretending forever. Diego wasn't stupid, and Clara had the feeling that sooner or later he would discover the truth, and then everything would change. Each visit from Diego became more tense. It began with polite conversations, but quickly turned into uncomfortable questions about Julian's health and his will. Clara, always present, intervened with evasive answers, but she noticed how Diego was growing impatient. It was clear that he wasn't going to wait much longer. The night of Don Julian's heart attack was a turning point. Clara realized that Diego wasn't just a concerned brother. He was a dangerous man who would do anything to take Julian's fortune. With each passing day, Clara felt the situation was becoming more critical. Don Julian was fighting not just for his life, but for everything he had built, and Clara knew she had to be by his side to help him win that battle. The next time Diego came to the mansion, Clara would be ready. Diego had convinced Julian to sign a legal power of attorney to take control of his vast fortune and properties, under the pretext of taking care of him. Despite Clara's constant vigilance and Don Julian's worsening health, Diego continued advancing his plan, with the cunning of a predator lying in wait. The legal power he had managed to get Julian to sign months ago, when his illness was not yet as severe, granted Diego the authority to manage part of his brother's business. Although at that time it seemed like an innocent agreement to ease Julian's burden, Diego's intentions had always been darker. When Diego suggested the idea of the power of attorney, he presented it in such a meticulously calculated way that Julian couldn't see the danger. Diego had insisted that everything was for his brother's sake, assuring him that he only wanted to help manage his affairs while he recovered. "Don't worry, Julian," Diego had told him in his most confident tone. "I just want you to focus on your health. Let me take care of the financial aspects in business for now. Everything will be in order for when you're better." At the time, Julian, exhausted by the early symptoms of his illness, had accepted his brother's help, without suspecting that the man he called family was, in reality, plotting how to strip him of everything. The document gave Diego the power to sign contracts, manage properties, and most importantly, make crucial financial decisions. At first, Diego seemed to follow his brother's instructions, but little by little, he began to extend his tentacles over all aspects of Julian's life. Clara, meanwhile, gradually began to uncover the magnitude of what was happening. As Julian's caregiver, she was not initially aware of the legal details, but after the heart attack and the more intimate conversations she had with Julian, she began to realize that Diego already had significant control in his hands. This alarmed her deeply, but what worried her most was that Julian, although aware of the threat, seemed resigned to what was happening. "Clara," he told her one afternoon while lying in bed with a somber look, "my brother has always been ambitious. I knew it, but I thought I could control him. Now that my health is declining, I feel like I no longer have the strength to fight him. I signed that damned power because at the time I believed I could trust him. But now, everything has changed." Clara felt a knot in her stomach as she heard these words. She knew that Julian needed more than just medical care. He needed someone to help him regain control of his life. But how could she, a simple caregiver, stand up to someone as cunning and ruthless as Diego? The tension increased every time Diego arrived at the mansion. His behavior remained polite in appearance, but his increasingly probing questions about Julian's affairs and his hints that things needed to change became unsettling. During one of his visits, Diego took advantage of his brother's illness to introduce the idea of selling some of the family's properties, arguing that maintaining them was an unnecessary financial burden. "Julian, you must understand that you are no longer the man you used to be," Diego said in a soft tone, but one loaded with hidden malice. "Your health is worsening, and it's better that we start getting rid of some of the properties. You don't need that much money now, and the businesses require someone who can manage them actively. I'm here to help you to relieve that burden from your shoulders." Clara, who had overheard the conversation from the kitchen while preparing tea for both of them, felt her blood boil. It was evident that Diego didn't want to relieve Julian's burden. He wanted to take everything he could. It was clear that, under the pretense of caring for his brother, Diego was manipulating Julian, using his illness as an opportunity to seize the fortune that wasn't rightfully his. Diego had reached such a level of confidence that he even began organizing meetings with lawyers and real estate agents without Julian's knowledge. Clara realized this one day when, while going through the house's mail, she found an envelope addressed to Diego with information about the sale of one of Julian's most valuable properties, a building in the city center, designed by him, which had been one of his greatest architectural works. Outraged, Clara decided to confront Diego. She knew Julian was too weak to face his brother directly, but she wasn't going to let Diego go ahead with his plan without doing something about it. Clara had already taken on the role of Julian's wife in public, and although she wasn't his real wife, she felt a growing responsibility toward him. After all, she had seen firsthand how important it was for Julian to keep what he had built during his life. One afternoon, when Diego arrived for one of his courtesy visits, Clara intercepted him before he could enter Julian's room. "Diego, we need to talk," Clara said firmly, blocking his way in the hallway. Diego, surprised by Clara's authoritative tone, looked at her with a mix of curiosity and disdain. "You? What do you think you can tell me? You're nothing more than my brother's caregiver," he responded arrogantly. Clara, unfazed, looked him straight in the eye. "I'm more than that. I'm here every day taking care of him, looking out for his well-being, and I'm not going to let you keep manipulating him into selling the properties he loves and that cost him so much to build." Diego let out a bitter laugh. "What do you know about what's best for him? Julian is dying. There's nothing you can do about it." It's only a matter of time before I take full control of his business, and you won't have any part in it. You're replaceable, Clara." But Clara didn't back down. "Maybe I'm replaceable," she admitted, "but you can't just take away everything he's achieved. I know that what you're doing is illegal. He signed that power of attorney in a moment of weakness, believing he could trust you. If you dare to sell any property without his full consent, I'll make sure everyone knows what you're doing." Diego's face tightened. Clearly, he hadn't expected Clara to be so determined, or to know so many details. He had always underestimated her, seeing her only as an insignificant caregiver. Now he realized that she posed a threat. "I suggest you stay out of this, Clara," Diego said in a darker tone. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. Don't get involved in my business, or you might regret it." Clara stared back at him. She knew Diego was dangerous, but she also knew that Julian needed her. And while she wasn't an expert in law or business, she understood that Diego was plotting something illegal. She couldn't allow this man to get away with it. After that confrontation, Clara became even more vigilant. She not only had to take care of Julian's health, but also keep an eye on every move Diego made. She knew time was running out, and if they didn't act soon, Diego would take everything. Determined to stop him, Clara began seeking legal advice on her own. She spoke with a lawyer recommended by a friend, explaining the situation and showing him the documents she had found. The lawyer, surprised by what he heard, explained that there were ways to revoke the power Diego had if they could prove there was a breach of trust or that Julian wasn't in full capacity when he signed it. That would be the key. Clara knew that the only way to save Don Julian's fortune and legacy would be to prove that Diego had manipulated him in his moment of vulnerability. Julian, realizing his brother's true intentions, asked Clara to continue pretending to be his wife to prevent Diego from taking everything. Don Julian, weakened by illness and the constant pressures from his brother Diego, began to see more clearly the betrayal unfolding before his eyes. Over the past few months, Clara had been his only ally. While his physical health deteriorated, his mind remained sharp, and he observed each of his brother's moves. But what worried him the most was the increasing influence Diego seemed to have over the family business, and especially over his legacy. It was at that moment that he realized his only option to survive this silent war was to rely on Clara, not just as a caregiver, but as a key figure in his protection. One day, while Clara was adjusting the medication on Julian's bedside table, he decided to speak honestly. He knew time was against him, and that if he didn't take drastic measures soon, everything he had built over decades would be at risk of falling into the wrong hands. "Clara, I need to ask you something else, something that won't be easy," Julian began, his voice weak but laden with seriousness. Clara, noticing the serious tone, set aside what she was doing and sat by his side looking at him with concern. Julian continued, "You must keep pretending to be my wife, at least for a while longer. If Diego believes that you have control over my decisions or that you influence my affairs, he will stay at bay. He thinks he can manipulate me, but if he sees you as an obstacle, he will hesitate to act immediately." Clara looked at him in disbelief. She had already accepted the fictitious role of Julian's wife during Diego's previous visits, but maintaining that facade for an extended period was a challenge she wasn't sure she could handle. However, Julian kept talking, his tone revealing a mixture of desperation and conviction. "I have no one else to trust. You've been here taking care of me, and I know you have no interest in my fortune. But Diego, he wants everything. He's waiting for me to fall completely to take control." Julian's gaze was deep and serious. In that moment, Clara realized how truly alone he was. She knew that her decision could change Julian's fate and prevent Diego from achieving his goals. Despite the fear she felt at the thought of confronting a man like Diego, Clara understood that she couldn't abandon Julian now. She had already taken a stand, and although it had all started as a way to help a sick old man, it had now become a fight to save his legacy and protect him from the clutches of his brother. Clara took a breath, gathering courage, and nodded. "I'll do it, Don Julian," she replied firmly. "I'll keep being your wife if that's what it takes to keep Diego away. But we have to be careful. He's not stupid, and if he discovers we're lying, he might become more aggressive." Julian looked at her with gratitude, his expression softening for a moment. "I knew I could trust you, Clara. You're right. We must be careful. But I can't let Diego get away with this. I don't want my life to end with him taking everything I've achieved. My legacy, my works, everything I've built will disappear if he takes control." In the days that followed, Clara took on her role with greater dedication. Every time Diego visited the mansion, Clara was always present, not just as a caregiver, but as Julian's supposed wife. Although the fictitious relationship between them wasn't something Diego accepted immediately, Clara played her part with surprising naturalness. She knew that Julian's future depended on her executing this deception well. Diego, for his part, soon began to show signs of discomfort. At first, he had underestimated Clara, seeing her only as a young caregiver with no real weight in family matters. But now, with each visit, he noticed that Clara had a more important role than he had imagined. During one of his visits, Diego couldn't help but make sarcastic comments about the situation. "It's curious," Diego said, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "My brother never showed any interest in marriage, and now, all of a sudden, a young wife appears who always seems to be by his side. Nothing personal, Clara, but I can't help but wonder if it's really him making all the decisions, or if you have more influence than you should." Clara, prepared for such comments, remained calm and responded serenely. "I'm here to make sure Don Julian is well cared for and that his wishes are respected. Nothing more. If that bothers you, I'm sorry, but my priority is his well-being." Diego watched her with a mixture of suspicion and disdain. Clara knew he didn't see her as a real threat, but she also understood that could change at any moment. She knew that deep down, Diego distrusted her and had probably already started asking questions on his own. But until he had solid evidence, he couldn't do anything to remove her from Julian's life. In one of the most tense visits, Diego tried a different tactic. He decided to confront Julian directly, taking advantage of a moment when Clara had left the room to bring him a cup of tea. "Brother, this has gone on long enough," Diego said seriously, approaching Julian's bed. "You know you can't keep going like this. You're too sick to make important decisions. Let me take care of everything. I can ensure that your legacy stays intact, but you need to sign the papers I gave you last time." Julian, though weakened, did not allow his brother to intimidate him. "I won't sign anything, Diego. I've already given you enough control. I don't need you to take care of me. Clara is here for that. I'm not going to give up another property." Diego gritted his teeth, frustrated by his brother's resistance. However, before he could respond, Clara returned to the room, interrupting the conversation. She immediately sensed the tension in the air. "Is everything okay here?" she asked, though she knew something wasn't right. "Perfectly fine," Diego said, his tone dripping with falsehood. "We were just discussing some family matters. Don't worry, Clara." Despite his words, Clara could see the discontent on Diego's face. She knew he wasn't willing to let things end like this. Diego was patient and knew how to play the long game, but his patience seemed to be wearing thin. Clara saw him growing more anxious, and that only increased her concern. In private, Julian and Clara discussed the best way to protect his assets. Julian's lawyer had begun investigating ways to revoke the power of attorney he had given Diego, but the process would not be easy or quick. Diego had been smart enough to legally cover himself, and Julian, aware of his physical weakness, feared he wouldn't have enough time to stop his brother before it was too late. "The only thing I can do is keep resisting," Julian told Clara one night, as they reviewed the legal documents the lawyer had sent. "If I can buy some time, maybe we can find a permanent solution." Clara listened carefully, aware of the enormous responsibility now resting on her shoulders. She was not just Julian's caregiver, but also his protector, his only ally in a battle fought in the shadows. She knew that Diego would not stop until he got what he wanted, but she was also determined to fight for Julian, even if it meant risking her own safety. With each passing day, the tension increased, and Clara mentally prepared herself for the inevitable final confrontation with Diego. She knew the situation was reaching a critical point, but she also trusted that somehow they would find a way to save Julian's legacy before it was too late. As Clara investigated, she discovered that Diego had been diverting millions from the family businesses and hiding his financial mismanagement. As the days passed at Don Julian's mansion, the tension became palpable. Clara remained steadfast in her commitment to protect Julian, not only by taking care of his health but also by pretending to be his wife to keep Diego at bay. However, despite her efforts to maintain appearances, she knew something darker was happening. She had noticed a change in Diego, a sense of urgency in every visit as if time was running out for him. His constant suggestions about selling properties and his insistence that Julian sign more legal documents hinted that he was desperate to gain full control. Clara, intuitive by nature, knew there was more at play than Diego was letting on. She decided it was time to investigate on her own and discover what was really happening. She knew that if she could find some irregularity in Diego's actions, she could better protect Julian and stop the silent assault on his fortune. One day, while reviewing some papers in the mansion's library, Clara found a folder that Diego had left there during one of his previous visits. Although it wasn't her place to look through private documents, her instinct pushed her to open it. As she examined the papers, she realized that many of them were financial reports and balance sheets from Julian's family businesses. Clara wasn't a financial expert, but she noticed several discrepancies in the numbers. There were transactions that seemed out of place and amounts that didn't correspond with the usual income of the businesses. Determined to gather more information, Clara decided to contact Julian's accountant, a man who had worked with him for years and whom Julian trusted completely. She knew that unlike Diego, this man had a genuine commitment to Julian's well-being and his legacy. She called the accountant, Alejandro, and asked him to meet her at the mansion, without mentioning anything to Diego to avoid raising suspicion. Alejandro arrived discreetly one afternoon and sat with Clara in the mansion's sitting room, where they began to review the documents she had found. At first, Alejandro didn't seem too alarmed. It's normal to have some minor discrepancies in the accounts of large companies, especially when someone else is temporarily managing the businesses, he said, referring to the control Diego had, thanks to the power of attorney Julian had granted him. However, as they went deeper into the review, Alejandro's expression began to change. His face shifted from calm to concern, and then to astonishment. "This isn't right," he muttered as he underlined a series of transactions that seemed to be diverting large sums of money into external bank accounts. Clara, seeing Alejandro's reaction, felt her own worry intensify. "What does this mean?" she asked, fearing the worst. Alejandro sighed, aware that he was about to reveal something serious. "It means that Diego has been using his control over the companies to divert funds. He has been moving money into accounts that are not related to the businesses or Don Julian's interests. And what's worse, he's been hiding this diversion under legitimate transactions. This is full-scale fraud, Clara." Clara felt the air grow heavier around her. The suspicions she had about Diego were now confirmed, but the extent of his betrayal was far greater than she had imagined. Diego wasn't just trying to take over Julian's fortune through legal maneuvers. He had already been stealing large sums of money, endangering the entire family's wealth. "How much money has he diverted?" Clara asked, her voice trembling as she tried to process the magnitude of what she was hearing. Alejandro reviewed the figures again, calculating quickly. "In the last 6 months, it looks like he's diverted at least several million. But this is only what we can see in these documents. If he's been doing this for longer or on a larger scale, the damage could be much worse." The weight of those words hit Clara like a heavy blow. Diego had been stealing millions from Julian's businesses without anyone noticing, and if they didn't stop him soon, the entire empire that Julian had built could collapse. But the worst part was that Julian had no idea about the magnitude of what was happening behind his back. Clara knew she had to act, but she couldn't do it alone. She asked Alejandro to gather as much information as possible, and prepare a detailed report of the irregularities. "We need solid proof before confronting Diego," Clara said, the determination visible in her eyes. "If we're going to stop him, we need to do it in a way that he can't escape the consequences." Alejandro nodded, fully aware of the gravity of the situation. "I'm going to need a few days to gather everything. I'll have to access more records, but I assure you I'll do it discreetly. We can't let Diego find out we're investigating. If he does, he might try to destroy evidence or even disappear with the money." Clara understood that they were in a race against time. Diego was playing a dangerous game, and he did so with the confidence of someone who believed he would never be caught. But now that Clara and Alejandro knew the truth, they couldn't sit back and do nothing. In the following days, Clara stayed close to Julian, trying not to show her concern while Alejandro worked quietly. However, every time Diego appeared at the mansion, Clara couldn't help but feel tense. She knew they had valuable information, but until everything was prepared, any wrong move could ruin their efforts. One afternoon, while Diego was at the mansion reviewing some documents with Julian, Clara couldn't help but notice how his behavior had become more erratic. He seemed more anxious than usual, constantly checking his phone and asking even more direct questions about Julian's finances. "Julian, you really should consider selling the house in the countryside," Diego said, with a tone that tried to sound casual, but Clara detected an urgency in his words. "It's too big for you, and with the current market situation, you could get a good sum of money." Julian, still recovering from his recent health crisis, looked at him with distrust. "I'm not selling anything, Diego. I've told you before, I don't need money, and I'm not willing to get rid of what I've built." Diego tried to maintain his composure, but Clara noticed that he was losing patience. Each refusal from Julian seemed to irritate him more, and Clara knew she couldn't allow the situation to deteriorate further. Finally, when Diego left that afternoon, Clara took the opportunity to speak with Julian in private. She knew she couldn't tell him everything she had discovered until they had irrefutable proof, but she also knew she couldn't leave him in the dark any longer. "Don Julian," Clara began with a cautious but firm tone, "there's something you need to know about Diego. I can't go into details right now, but I have reason to believe that he's been making dangerous moves with your businesses and money. I've been investigating, and Alejandro is helping us review everything. But I need you to trust me and not sign anything until we have all the information." Julian, though tired and weakened, looked at Clara with a mix of concern and gratitude. "I've always known that Diego didn't have good intentions," he said, his voice trembling but clear. "But if what you're saying is true, then we're in more trouble than I thought." Clara nodded solemnly. "We're close to uncovering the whole truth. I just ask that you stay strong and don't let Diego pressure you. Soon we'll have everything we need to stop him." Julian took a deep breath, knowing that the biggest battle was still ahead. But now, thanks to Clara, he had a chance to save what he had built. Finally, with the help of a trusted lawyer, Clara uncovered Diego's frauds. Diego was arrested, and Don Julian regained control of his fortune, offering Clara a key role as the administrator of his businesses. The truth had come to light, and Clara knew there was no time to waste. The report Alejandro had prepared was complete and detailed. Every suspicious transaction, every diversion of funds, and every financial maneuver that Diego had hidden, it was all documented. The evidence was solid and strong enough to take legal action against Diego. Clara knew they were now in a dangerous position. If Diego suspected they were about to expose him, he could try to flee or destroy any other evidence they had. Clara and Alejandro decided it was time to contact a trusted lawyer who could guide them through the next steps. They knew they needed someone experienced in financial and fraud cases to handle this delicate matter. That's when Clara remembered a lawyer who had worked with the family of a former patient she had cared for, someone with an impeccable reputation and known for his unwavering ethics, Manuel Torres. Manuel was a serious man with a solid track record in complex corporate fraud and corruption cases. Clara contacted him immediately, explaining the situation concisely and asking for a meeting as soon as possible. Manuel agreed to meet them at the mansion, where they would review the evidence and decide what to do next. On the day of the meeting, Manuel arrived at the mansion with an imposing but calm presence. His tall figure and perfectly pressed suit reflected the professionalism with which he handled every case. Clara received him nervously but confident that he was the right man to help them. After presenting the documents Alejandro had gathered, Manuel reviewed everything carefully, maintaining a deep silence as his eyes scanned each page. Finally, he looked up and spoke. "This is enough to accuse him of fraud and embezzlement without a doubt. Diego has been stealing from the companies for months, if not longer. What concerns me most is that he seems on the verge of making bigger moves. Clearly, he's trying to liquidate some of Don Julian's most valuable properties. If he's allowed to proceed, your brother won't just lose millions, but his legacy will be ruined." Clara nodded, sharing the same concern. They knew Diego was growing more desperate, and Julian's constant refusals to sign the documents only made him act with more urgency. Manuel continued, "We must act quickly. The situation is delicate because, although we have proof of fraud, Diego still holds the legal power that grants him some control over the businesses. We need to revoke that power before he can cause more damage. Additionally, I'll file a formal lawsuit against him and request an immediate arrest warrant to prevent him from attempting to flee." Clara felt a mix of relief and fear. She knew they were about to confront Diego directly, and although the evidence was on their side, she also knew Diego wouldn't surrender without a fight. Manuel and Clara spoke with Don Julian the next day. Although weakened by illness, Julian was more determined than ever to stop his brother. With Manuel's help, Julian signed a declaration revoking the power of attorney he had given Diego months earlier. He also authorized the lawyer to proceed with the fraud lawsuit. Manuel acted quickly. He requested a court order to freeze Diego's bank accounts and block any attempt to sell Julian's properties. He also filed the lawsuit for fraud and corruption, exposing the embezzlement of millions from the family businesses. With the evidence in hand and Don Julian's legal backing, Manuel soon obtained an arrest warrant for Diego. What followed was a chain of events that unfolded quickly. The day the authorities arrived at the mansion to arrest Diego, Clara was present. She saw him enter the house as confident as ever, with no idea of what was about to happen. However, Diego soon noticed that something was off. The security guards, who usually greeted him politely, were watching him with suspicion. Clara observed him from a distance with a mix of nerves and satisfaction, knowing that the truth was finally about to come to light. At that moment, the police arrived at the mansion. Diego, surprised, tried to act indifferent as the officers approached him. "What's all this?" he asked arrogantly. One of the officers, in a firm tone, responded, "Diego Martinez, you are under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and breach of trust. We have a court order against you." Diego's reaction was immediate. His face, which normally wore an expression of superiority, turned pale. His eyes filled with surprise and rage as he tried to process what he had just heard. "This is ridiculous," he exclaimed, looking around as if seeking support from someone. "You have no idea what you're doing. This is a misunderstanding." But the officers weren't intimidated. They proceeded to handcuff him while reading him his rights. Diego tried to resist, throwing accusations and furious glares toward Clara, whom he seemed to blame for what was happening. "This is your fault," he shouted as the officers escorted him toward the exit. "You planned all of this. You don't know what you've gotten yourself into." Clara watched in silence, knowing that finally, after months of manipulation and deceit, justice was catching up with Diego. The mansion, which had once witnessed Diego's schemes and betrayals, now became a symbol of his downfall. After Diego's arrest, Clara returned to Julian's side. She knew that although the legal battle had ended, the process of recovery for Julian and his legacy was just beginning. Manuel would continue working to recover the embezzled funds and ensure that Julian's properties remained safe. In the months that followed, with Diego in prison and the company's accounts stabilizing thanks to the intervention of Manuel and Alejandro, Julian began to notice an improvement in his health. The pressure he had felt for so long, the constant stress of facing his brother, dissipated. Although his illness still weakened him, he was more at peace and with a clear mind, knowing that his life and legacy were in good hands. One day, after a long meeting with Manuel and Alejandro, Julian turned to Clara. "I don't know how I'll ever be able to thank you for everything you've done for me. You didn't just save my life with your care, you saved me from losing everything I've built." Clara smiled but shook her head. "You don't need to thank me, Don Julian. I just did what I thought was right." Julian looked at her seriously. "You've done more than that, Clara, and I want you to remain a part of my life. Not just as a caregiver, but as part of my team. I want you to be the administrator of my businesses. There's no one I trust more than you." Clara remained silent for a moment, surprised by the offer. She knew Julian valued her, but she had never expected something so significant. Finally, with an excited smile, she accepted. Over time, Clara took on her new role as the administrator of Don Julian's businesses, overseeing the finances and ensuring that everything was managed transparently and efficiently. Her dedication and loyalty transformed Julian's business structure, giving it new momentum and ensuring that his legacy remained intact. Thus, Diego's betrayal was overcome, and Clara became not only a protector of Julian, but also a key figure in the recovery and continued success of his empire. Don Julian, at the end of his days, was able to rest peacefully, knowing there was someone he could trust completely. And Clara, having started as a caregiver, found her own place in a world she never imagined, proving that the true value of a person is not in their starting position, but in their ability to face adversity with integrity and courage. If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support inspires us to keep sharing exciting stories almost every day. Don't miss the next surprising narrative that will appear on your screen soon. We truly appreciate your support. Now you can click on the links that are appearing, where we have prepared a special selection full of valuable stories and guaranteed entertainment. See you soon.